4 interruptions, 1 line. That's all it took for Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to dismantle a Supreme Court justice and expose a TV host on his own show. This wasn't just a debate, it was a masterclass in preparation, poise, and public annihilation. What was supposed to be a civilized discussion on Bill Maher's show about criticizing the Supreme Court quickly devolved into a live-action takedown, a carefully laid trap that ended up catching the wrong people. The entire spectacle was engineered by Maher himself, who, in a bid to create primetime drama, invited both Justice Clarence Thomas and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to his stage. The intended outcome was clear: to frame Crockett's pointed critiques of the court as baseless defamation, thereby protecting the sanctity of an institution Thomas represents. It was meant to be a public scolding, a lesson taught by 2 powerful men to a supposedly overeager newcomer. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They thought Jasmine Crockett came to argue, she came to win. The stage was set, the lights were hot, and Bill Maher kicked things off with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The whole segment was framed as a philosophical query, a gentleman's debate about whether fierce criticism of the Supreme Court crosses a sacred line into defamation. This intellectual framing was, of course, a thinly veiled excuse to put Jasmine Crockett on the defensive for comments she had made about Justice Thomas's ethical lapses. Maher, playing the role of the concerned moderator, turned to Crockett, his question dripping with faux concern. He essentially asked her to justify her so-called defamatory statements, effectively positioning her as the aggressor against a revered American institution. The why behind this maneuver was simple: to create a hero-villain narrative where the established, powerful figures were the victims of a rabble-rouser. But Crockett wasn't playing his game. She calmly looked at Maher, then at Thomas, and delivered a line that set the tone for the entire night. She said, "The truth, Bill, does not become defamation simply because it makes a powerful man uncomfortable." The air crackled. The audience, expecting a polite political sparring match, leaned in. This was something different. Justice Thomas, clearly not accustomed to being challenged so directly, decided to interject. But he didn't engage with the substance of her statement. Instead, he chose condescension, a classic tool of someone who has lost the argument before it's even begun. He waved a dismissive hand, a smug smile playing on his lips, and referred to Crockett as young, a child, and a student who didn't understand the complexities of the law. He did this to belittle her, to invalidate her position not with facts but with patronizing labels, hoping the audience would see her as an impudent upstart. It was a textbook power play executed live on national television. It was also a massive mistake. Crockett didn't flinch. She let him finish, held his gaze, and responded with a line that drew the first round of thunderous applause. "With all due respect, Justice," she began, her voice steady and clear, "respect is not silence, respect is accountability." In that single sentence, she reframed the entire debate. She wasn't the disrespectful one, she was the one demanding the respect that the institution is supposed to earn. Having failed to dismiss her with condescension, Justice Thomas decided it was time to pull rank and spring his trap. He believed Crockett was just a politician armed with talking points, not a seasoned lawyer who knew her way around a courtroom. The what was a classic legal ambush. He planned to bury her under the weight of an obscure legal citation, a tactic designed to make her look ignorant and unprepared. The why was to reclaim his authority and expose her as an intellectual fraud in front of millions. So Thomas leaned into his microphone and posed a complex question, citing a convoluted legal precedent he was certain she wouldn't know. He sat back, the smug look returning, expecting a fumbling, evasive answer. He didn't get one. Instead, Jasmine Crockett smiled. It was a small, knowing smile that told everyone in the room that the hunter was about to become the hunted. She didn't just answer his question, she countered with a legal citation of her own. "That's an interesting point, Justice," she said, her tone deceptively casual. "It almost reminds me of the precedent set in United States v. Holland, a fascinating case about judicial ethics." The studio fell silent. Bill Maher looked confused, and Thomas's smile vanished. Crockett wasn't done. She leaned forward, locking eyes with the justice, and delivered the killing blow. "You're familiar with that case, aren't you, Justice? Because you should be. You signed the majority opinion." The sound in the studio was a collective gasp, followed by another wave of applause. She hadn't just dodged the trap, she had picked it up and hit him over the head with it. It was a stunning reversal, proving that she hadn't just come prepared to defend her words, she had come prepared to prosecute her case. She even added a little flair, a fictional quip for the ages. "Did you need me to read your own opinion back to you, Justice? I brought my reading glasses, they work just fine, unlike, it seems, someone's memory." The atmosphere on stage had now shifted from a tense debate to a full-blown courtroom drama, and Congresswoman Crockett was revealing herself to be the star prosecutor. The balance of power had visibly tilted. Maher, sensing his show was spiraling out of his control, tried to intervene, but Crockett was now in command. She calmly reached down beside her chair and placed a sleek black briefcase on her lap. The click of the latches echoed through the silent studio. "You know, Bill," she said, not even looking at him, "since the justice is so fond of evidence and precedent, I thought it would be helpful to bring some." This was the moment the night transformed from a verbal sparring match into a public trial. Maher and Thomas thought they were debating ideas. Crockett was here to present facts, and her first exhibit was a bombshell. She pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This," she announced, "is an internal email from the justice's own office." She held it up for the camera to see. The what was damning was a direct instruction regarding travel arrangements. The why it mattered was even worse. It was a clear attempt to hide something. Crockett read the key line aloud, her voice ringing with clarity. "For the justice's request, please ensure his name is not logged for the Gulfstream V flight to Bali." She let the words hang in the air. "Now, I'm just a simple congresswoman," she continued, with a delightful touch of feigned humility, "but usually when you don't want your name in a log, it's because you're not supposed to be on the flight. Or perhaps you just misplaced your frequent flyer number and didn't want the embarrassment?" The joke landed perfectly, cutting through the tension with a slice of sarcasm. She had just presented concrete evidence of a deliberate cover-up, live on air. Clarence Thomas was visibly reeling, his face a mixture of shock and fury. He started to bluster to interrupt, but Crockett simply held up her hand and pulled out another document from her briefcase of nightmares. "I'm not finished," she said, her voice now cold and hard. "Exhibit B this time, it was a call log. The what was a record of 2 phone calls. The why they were significant was explosive. This is a log of 2 calls placed from your chambers, Justice, to the personal office of Sterling Viceroy, a businessman whose company had a major case pending before the Supreme Court." She detailed the how, explaining that the calls were made just days before the court issued a surprise ruling that benefited Viceroy's company to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. The implication was undeniable, a direct line of communication between a Supreme Court justice's office and a litigant. At this point, the only thing sweating more than Clarence Thomas was Bill Maher's producer, who was probably updating his resume on LinkedIn and simultaneously Googling how to fake your own death and move to Mexico. Crockett had come with receipts, turning Maher's stage into her own personal courtroom. This is where Bill Maher truly began to panic. The segment had gone completely off the rails. It was no longer his show. He was a bystander watching a meticulously planned demolition. He attempted to regain control using his usual toolkit, snarky interruptions and whataboutisms. He tried to crack a joke to diffuse the tension, to pivot the conversation, to do anything to stop the bleeding. He interrupted Crockett 4 times in quick succession, trying to throw her off her game. He said things like, "All right, let's not get into the weeds here, and both sides have their issues, let's be fair." The why was transparent. He needed to protect his guest and, more importantly, his own image as the unflappable host who was above the fray. He was trying to turn a moment of profound accountability into just another segment of political theater. And that's when Jasmine Crockett delivered the single line that gave this legendary confrontation its name. On his 4th interruption, she stopped. She turned her full attention from Justice Thomas and looked directly at Bill Maher. The audience held its breath. With ice in her voice, she simply said, "Bill, is this a serious discussion about accountability, or is this just entertainment for you?" It was a devastating question. It wasn't just a shutdown, it was an indictment. She exposed the core conflict of his entire brand, the pretense of serious inquiry versus the reality of shallow entertainment. She called him out for trying to hide the truth from his own audience, for valuing a good show over a good democracy. The question hung in the air, unanswered because it was unanswerable. Maher was silenced. He had been so focused on trapping Crockett that he never imagined she would turn the spotlight on him, the puppet master. In that moment, he was no longer the host. He was just another powerful man being held to account by a woman who refused to be silenced. She might as well have added, "The adults are talking now, Bill. You can go back to the kids' table." With Maher effectively neutralized and Thomas rendered speechless, Crockett went back to her briefcase. The final act was about to begin. She wasn't going to leave any room for doubt. She pulled out her final pieces of evidence, not with a flourish, but with the grim determination of someone finishing a job. "Let's talk about finances," she said, her voice low and steady. First, she produced copies of Thomas's own financial disclosure forms. The what was missing. Why was to establish a clear pattern of deception. Using a red pen, she had circled the sections where he was legally required to list gifts and sponsored travel. The pages were almost entirely blank. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Crockett mused. "A man of your stature with so many generous friends, and yet you seem to have the memory of a goldfish when it comes time to fill out these forms. Or maybe the trips were so forgettable they just slipped your mind. Private jet to private island." "Yeah, that sounds like a Tuesday." Then came the final blow. The smoking gun. She laid a single document flat on the table in front of her. It was a payment record. The what was a direct transaction. The why was its origin. "This," she said, pointing to the paper, "is a record showing that your grandnephew's private school tuition was paid year after year by Harlan Crow, a billionaire donor." She paused to let that sink in. A donor who coincidentally has had business interests in multiple cases that have come before your court. She then slid another document next to it. And this is the record of a luxury RV you purchased, an RV worth over $250,000. A loan for that RV was quietly forgiven by another one of your wealthy friends. She looked up from the papers and straight at Thomas. I'm no accountant, Justice, but even I know you're supposed to declare your income, not just your indignation. Case was closed. She had presented motive, opportunity, and a mountain of evidence. All that was left was the closing statement. Jasmine Crockett slowly gathered her papers, her movements deliberate and calm. She didn't gloat, she didn't raise her voice. She simply rose to the occasion, embodying the very principles she was fighting for. She looked past the cameras as if speaking to the entire nation. She began a quote from the document that Justice Thomas was sworn to uphold. The Constitution of the United States makes one thing perfectly clear, she said, her voice resonating with conviction. No person shall be above the law. She then slowly turned her head and fixed her gaze directly on the now silent, stone-faced Clarence Thomas. She leaned slightly toward her microphone and delivered the final, devastating line of the night. Not even a justice. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a paradigm shifting, the sound of an untouchable figure being brought crashing down to earth. Bill Maher sat stunned, his show in ruins around him. Justice Thomas was a statue of impotent fury, and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood as a testament to the power of truth, preparation, and unwavering courage. She had walked into an ambush and walked out a giant, not just by defending herself, but by prosecuting a case for the soul of American justice on live television. She proved that night that you don't need a gavel to bring down the house. Sometimes, all you need is the truth, a briefcase full of receipts. And the courage to speak.